You were half listening. Some old jazz standard had been playing for the past few minutes, humming low in the background while you did whatever it was you were doing. The kind of aimless late-night routine that keeps you up even when you know you should be asleep. Then, static. Not the gentle crackle of weak reception. This was something heavier, louder. The kind of static that feels intentional, like someone is grabbing hold of the signal itself and squeezing until it bleeds noise. You lean in, adjusting the dial, but nothing clears it. The static holds, filling the room like a pulse. You expect the music to return or maybe a station identification break, but instead there's silence. A silence so absolute it feels unnatural. Like every sound on earth took a collective breath and forgot to exhale. And then comes the voice, soft at first, like it's being spoken from a room too far away from the microphone. Male but aged, with that deliberate pace broadcasters use when they know the words they say will outlive them. This is an unscheduled broadcast. Do not adjust your dial. Stay tuned. Your stomach tightens. No station ID, no sponsor. Just a voice arriving from nowhere. You should turn it off, but you don't. The static swells again, folding over the voice like a tide dragging sand back into the sea. But it returns, clearer now, steady, like someone sitting directly in front of the mic. This message is being transmitted simultaneously across every frequency. If you are hearing this, you are not alone. There's no rush to the voice, no panic. If anything, it sounds resigned, like it's reading a eulogy that was written long before tonight. You glance at your phone, no signal. Your television, blank. Whatever this is, it's the only thing broadcasting. International authorities have confirmed reports first detected by theological monitoring stations. You pause. Theological monitoring stations? Is that a mistake? The term rolls through your mind, strange and unfamiliar. Heaven, the voice continues, has reached full capacity. Your breath catches in your throat. There's no elaboration, no fiery prophecy, no scripture to soften the blow. Just that one chilling statement, delivered with the weight of fact, like announcing a sunrise or the national debt. Heaven is full. It doesn't sound possible. How can a concept overflow? How can something infinite hit a limit? You wait for an explanation, some reassurance that this is a mistake, a hoax, maybe a bizarre marketing stunt. But the voice offers nothing. It simply repeats, slower this time. Heaven, stuhl, is full. You can almost hear the unspoken words hanging just behind the silence, and there is nowhere else to go. The voice continues, but it's no longer addressing you. It's reading a statement, a cold, official transmission, as if heaven's bureaucracy had drafted a press release. Effective immediately, no new souls will be admitted. You can't tell if you're breathing. The silence in the room is absolute, broken only by the whisper of your own pulse roaring in your ears. You want to laugh. This has to be a prank, but the tone is wrong. There's no punchline, waiting. Only the weight of what those words mean. Religions have built themselves on the idea that heaven is vast, endless. But now, here it is. A door slammed shut, a capacity reached, a line drawn. What happens now? The voice doesn't say. It simply moves on, listing coordinates of affected theological sites. Vatican servers, Mecca's emergency spiritual archive, hidden monasteries whose names you've never heard, all of them reporting the same phenomenon, a metaphysical traffic jam. The gate is locked. Somewhere in the distance, you hear sirens. Maybe someone heard the broadcast and lost it. Maybe you're losing it. You fumble for your phone again, still dead. Just you and the voice now. Heaven is full. This concludes the first phase of emergency religious containment protocols. Further instructions will follow. The static returns, folding over the voice until it's gone. There's nothing now. No explanation, no comfort, Just a silence thick with everything you don't want to believe. And then, just before the signal vanishes entirely, one last whisper, almost too faint to catch. Stay tuned. You need to hear this. You're not the only one hearing this. Across the country, maybe across the world, listeners are flooding station lines. Their voices shaking. Their questions running over each other like a rising tide. What kind of sick joke is this? One caller shouts. Another demands to know if it's a guerrilla marketing stunt or some deep web prank. The station can't answer. There's no one on staff responsible for this broadcast, and every attempt to cut the feed or switch frequencies ends the same way. Silence, followed by that same voice picking up exactly where it left off. Some listeners claim they heard the voice hours before the official broadcast started, cutting into personal playlists, hijacking podcasts mid-sentence. One man swears he heard it coming from his unplugged radio, voice crackling through speakers that shouldn't have been powered at all. Religious callers argue with skeptics live on air, some calling this a divine revelation, others screaming that it's heresy or psychological warfare. A preacher from Texas insists heaven can't be full because heaven is boundless. A trembling woman says her grandmother used to warn her about this, saying, "When heaven shuts its doors, the dead will come home." The station tries to regain control, commercial breaks, emergency override signals, but nothing works. The broadcast owns the air now, and underneath the static and arguing voices, the message plays again, quieter this time, almost like a whisper tucked inside the silence. Heaven is full. The voice returns, undeterred by the chaos its message unleashed. It doesn't acknowledge the callers, the confusion, or the panic that's now spreading like smoke through every city. Instead, it continues, calm, steady, and clinical. This concludes Phase 1 of Emergency Religious Containment Protocols. Containment. The word lingers, heavy, with implication. It makes heaven sound less like a promised paradise and more like a quarantine zone. The voice offers no interpretation, only the statement itself, left to fester in the silence that follows. Before listeners can react, the voice speaks again, sharper this time. Stay tuned for Phase 2. Further instructions will follow. You need to hear this. Then the static surges, swallowing the voice for just a breath before pulling back again, leaving only the hollow hum of an open frequency. Waiting. No sign-off, no explanation, just a blank space where answers should be. The phone lines light up again, desperate voices demanding to know what comes next. But the station has nothing to give them. Nothing except the same warning still clinging to the silence like a ghost. Stay tuned. It didn't take long. Within minutes of that first chilling message, every frequency seemed to bend around it. News anchors froze mid-sentence, their feeds abruptly replaced by emergency banners. The same words, repeated across languages and continents, scrolling along the bottom of every screen. Heaven is full. There was no interpretation at first, only the bare statement, hanging there like a glitch in reality. Government scrambled to respond, some claiming it was a hoax, others demanding patience while their experts reviewed the source. But the story was already bigger than them. Religious leaders were the first to react, some holding trembling press conferences, others barricading themselves in places of worship. In Vatican City, a cardinal's voice cracked as he spoke, admitting, between ragged breaths, that theological monitoring systems had been detecting something for months, a disturbance, an imbalance. They had no name for it, only a mounting pressure they couldn't explain, a spiritual weight they hoped would resolve itself. But now, that weight had broken through, and there was no hiding it anymore. The broadcast kept looping. Heaven is full. No elaboration, no comfort, no reassurance. Phones rang off the hook at every radio station, every newsroom, every government helpline. People demanded answers. What did it mean? Was death now a dead end? Governments urged calm, but their voices shook. You could hear the fear crawling up their throats. They didn't know what came next. No one did, but everyone knew the truth. If heaven was full, everything we thought we knew about life after death had just been rewritten on air, live, for the world to hear. Religious leaders were supposed to bring comfort in moments like this, but this time they couldn't even comfort themselves. One by one, they stepped in front of microphones. Rabbis, priests, imams, monks, each with hands shaking and eyes darting toward the heavens, as if they expected some divine correction to arrive and erase this whole nightmare. Instead, they confessed. They knew, not everything, but enough. Quiet warnings had passed through back channels for years. Rumors of souls unable to pass beyond. Prayers echoing back unanswered. Divine silence where guidance should have been. A bishop from Spain, pale and sweating under the studio lights, admitted the church had suppressed whispers of soul congestion. He said they called it the overflow, a term buried deep within Vatican documents dating back centuries. A televangelist broke down on live television, sobbing that the prosperity gospel he'd preached his entire career, the promise of rewards in the next life, was built on a door that no longer opened. Even the most devout voices cracked under the weight of it. They had preached infinite forgiveness, infinite paradise. But now that infinity had limits. And if heaven could fill, what else could? Was hell next? Were the dead truly gone? Or had they simply been waiting outside all this time, stacked like ghosts pressed against a locked door? Faith didn't just waver. It fractured. Outside mosques, synagogues, and temples, crowds gathered, not for prayer, but for answers. They demanded to know why this was hidden. Who knew? Who lied? The only answer anyone could give was the one they feared most, because none of us knew what to do. Faith had no map for this. No scripture covered what happens after the gates close, and the voice kept repeating, "Heaven is full, heaven is full." With theology collapsing in real time, the burden shifted to science. But science wasn't ready either. Physicists and metaphysical researchers were rushed onto live panels, forced to answer questions they'd never considered. Can a soul occupy space? Does heaven have a quantifiable capacity? Could a metaphysical realm run out of room? Some scientists scoffed at the premise, calling it theological theater. But their certainty faltered when reports surfaced that observatories monitoring cosmic radiation had detected subtle disruptions, patterns they couldn't explain, centered directly around locations long associated with spiritual passage. It was as though something had been physically closing, a door folding in on itself across dimensions. Theories split. Some believed the afterlife was never meant to handle population growth at this speed, that humanity's sheer numbers overwhelmed whatever system was meant to process death. Others proposed that heaven wasn't metaphysical at all, but some unknown form of extra-dimensional space governed by physical laws we've yet to understand. One astrophysicist admitted, reluctantly, that if heaven existed in any real capacity, it might be part of a cosmic traffic system, a tunnel meant to keep existence flowing between worlds. And if that tunnel collapsed, there would be nowhere left for the dead to go. No reincarnation, no ascension, no return, just souls piling up in the dark. In the background of every scientific debate, the broadcast still hummed, its message growing quieter, but somehow heavier, each time it repeated, "Heaven is full." Science was no longer debunking the divine. It was trying to explain it. And the world was listening, because if science couldn't unlock this, no one could. Or would you prefer I generate the full chapter in a single flow? The first reports came in less than an hour after the broadcast began. Emergency responders across cities reported a surge in calls, bodies discovered in bedrooms, bathtubs, and places of prayer. The pattern was unmistakable. They weren't people giving up. They were people trying to beat the line. The belief spread faster than the news itself. If heaven is full, but you die now, maybe you can slip through the cracks before the gates lock completely. It didn't matter that no religious doctrine had ever suggested heaven worked like a nightclub with a capacity limit. Fear rewrote theology faster than any preacher ever could. Some left notes, crumpled prayers, text messages to family saying they couldn't risk being left behind. One man called into a live broadcast, whispering through tears that he was going to get there first before heaven had a chance to say no. Religious leaders begged people to stop, but the pleas came too late. News anchors stumbled over words they'd never expected to read aloud. Mass suicide events linked directly to a spiritual traffic jam. And through it all, the message kept repeating across every frequency. Heaven is full. Heaven is full. Heaven is full. Some believed death was the only way to test the message's truth. If heaven was really sealed, they'd know soon enough. Others believed it was a final test, a way to prove faith, to show heaven. They were willing to risk everything just to get in. And the rest just didn't want to be left standing here, caught between life and the unknown void beyond. The lines to heaven weren't just theoretical anymore. They were forming in real time. And people were dying to get to the front. The calls kept coming. Grief-stricken family members sobbing into the phone, demanding to know where their loved ones went if heaven was no longer accepting arrivals. That's when the question started. First as a whisper, then louder, until it was rolling across every network, every press conference, every broken-down priest standing at a pulpit with shaking hands. Where do we go now? It wasn't philosophical anymore. It wasn't some late-night dorm room debate about the afterlife. It was a real, practical, terrifying question. If you died tonight, right now, in this moment, where would you go? If heaven is full, does your soul just stop? Does it hang in the air like static, caught between stations, never arriving anywhere? Or does it fall, slipping past heaven's gates into whatever waits beneath? Some scientists speculated that the soul, if it existed at all, might simply dissolve. Energy returned to the universe, scattered like ashes in a cosmic wind. But others warned of something darker. They said energy can't just disappear. And if the usual pathways are blocked, that energy, those souls, could start accumulating right here, stuck in a place not meant for them, a limbo built not in myth, but in the real world, right alongside us, invisible at first, then maybe not so invisible. Every faith had its own answer. Every scientist had a theory, but none of them knew for certain because no one had ever asked this question, expecting to actually need an answer. And with every hour that passed, the question became harder to ignore. Where do we go now? The voice had no answer, only silence, and the silence felt heavier than words ever could. The phone lines haven't stopped ringing. Not once. Every time one call ends, two more take its place. The voices on the other end are raw, some shaking with terror, others crackling with fury, but all of them unraveling under the weight of the same unbearable question. What happens to us now? One man whispers that his wife slit her wrists in the bathtub after the broadcast. Her Bible clutched so tight her fingernails tore the pages. He begs the host, begs you, to tell him she got through before the gates closed. Another caller insists she saw her dead mother standing outside her house, face pressed to the window, not alive but not gone either, just stuck, waiting. Some voices scream, others sob. A few collapse into silence, as though they've finally realized there's no answer anyone can give them. A truck driver swears he heard his own voice inside the static, calling his name from the other side. A teenage boy, barely old enough to understand mortality, asks if dying now means being trapped forever. lost between worlds, with nowhere left to go. The lines blur between the living and the dead, the rational and the desperate, and with every passing minute, the fear thickens, spreading like a virus through every frequency, every prayer, every heartbeat that still clings to hope. The voice from the broadcast no longer needs to speak. The callers themselves have become the message, and none of them can stop screaming. The next voice that comes through isn't screaming, it's whispering. It's low and hoarse, the kind of voice you only hear from someone who spent a lifetime preaching certainty and has just watched that certainty burn. He introduces himself as Father Malcolm, a priest for 30 years. He says the first time he heard whispers of the overflow was nearly a decade ago, passed between clergy like a dirty secret no one wanted to hold too long. There were hints in Vatican bulletins, cryptic phrases buried in theological memos, capacity limits, overflow scenarios, metaphysical gridlock. They all dismissed it. Heaven was infinite. That's what they taught. That's what they believed or wanted to believe. But year after year, the warnings grew louder, the strange spiritual disruptions harder to ignore, prayers unanswered, souls refusing to cross, a backlog building somewhere between life and eternity. And now the door has shut. Father Malcolm confesses that for the past year, every time he stood at the altar offering comfort, he was lying. Every sermon about paradise was a lie told with trembling hands, desperate to believe his own words. He's not the only one. Priests are leaving their churches mid-service. Imams are walking out of mosques. Rabbis stare at scripture and see only static. Entire congregations are dissolving as their leaders step down, unable to preach a faith they no longer believe. They knew. They knew heaven was failing, and they said nothing, not out of malice, but because they couldn't face a world where the promise of paradise was no longer guaranteed. The transmission carries his final words before the line goes dead. Forgive me. I knew. We all knew, and now it's too late. As the clergy falls silent, the void they leave behind is filled with something far more dangerous. Desperation. Families fracture along fault lines that were invisible just hours ago. In some homes, children turn on parents, demanding to know what happens when they die. In others, fathers force their families to kneel in prayer, screaming that only immediate repentance will break open heaven's locked doors. Religious factions begin forming inside living rooms, Bibles slammed onto kitchen tables, holy water poured over trembling heads. But just down the street, others take the opposite path, tearing crucifixes off walls, smashing altars, vowing never to believe in a system that left them stranded. Reports trickle in of domestic standoffs, parents holding children at gunpoint, demanding they pray now before it's too late. One woman calls the station in tears, saying her husband won't let their son eat until he's baptized. Again, just in case the first one didn't take. It's not just homes. Makeshift street pulpits appear overnight, self-proclaimed prophets screaming that they alone have the prayer that will unlock the gates. Crowds gather, fists clenched, hungry for answers or someone to blame. And in the spaces where faith dissolves entirely, something darker takes root. In some neighborhoods, homes without crosses in the window are marked as lost. Neighbors turning on neighbors, convinced that unbelievers somehow caused the gates to close. Some believe salvation is scarce, a finite resource now worth killing for. Faith has become a weapon, belief a currency, and no one, no family, no friendship will survive unscathed. And through it all, the broadcast continues, still repeating the words that shattered the world. Heaven is full. Religious collapse is one thing. Psychological collapse is another. By morning, mental health hotlines are overwhelmed. Psychologists, psychiatrists, and crisis counselors are dragged onto live broadcasts, asked to explain how billions of people are supposed to process the unthinkable. There is nowhere left to go. when you die? What happens to the human mind when you strip away the safety net? When death is no longer a doorway but a wall? The experts offer theories, but none of them sound reassuring. They talk about existential destabilization, the way the mind cracks when its entire belief system is torn out from under it. Some believe this is Judgment Day, not because of fire in the sky or horsemen riding down from the clouds, but because judgment is no longer a process. There's no review, no verdict, no final weighing of the soul. Judgment has been replaced with something worse: administrative rejection. Others think this isn't divine at all. They whisper about extraterrestrial interference, claiming the gates have been sealed from the outside, not by God, but by something else entirely. They point to ancient carvings, encrypted warnings in text predating any modern religion, stories of a lock placed on the doors of heaven to keep something in or something out. And then there are the skeptics, the rational minds clinging to any explanation other than the supernatural. To them, this is mass hysteria, a contagious spiritual panic triggered by a rogue broadcast amplified through social media's echo chamber. They insist heaven can't be full because heaven can't exist. But even the skeptics can't explain why the calls keep coming in from people hearing the same voices, whispering the same words across every language and every time zone, voices no one should be hearing. And the longer they listen, the more they begin to question their own sanity. It starts as background noise, a hum inside phone lines, a faint whisper when someone adjusts the volume on their television, static that shouldn't be there, but somehow is, and within it, fragments of voices no one wants to recognize. At first, it's dismissed as audio bleed, crossed wires, a side effect of every frequency carrying the same haunting broadcast. But then the reports shift. People aren't just hearing voices, they're hearing familiar voices. A woman in Chicago calls her local station, trembling as she explains that her mother's voice crackled through the kitchen radio. Her mother, who died 6 months ago, a trucker in Oklahoma, swears his radio switched frequencies on its own, and the voice of his childhood friend, dead since 1984, spoke his name. The dead aren't just memories anymore. They're in the static. Callers sob into the airwaves, begging for someone to explain why they can hear loved ones whispering from beyond. Some claim the voices are comforting, soft apologies, or goodbyes that were never spoken, but others describe something darker. They say the voices sound angry, trapped, blaming the living for closing the door behind them. One man claims his late father's voice told him to stay alive, no matter what, because if he dies now, he'll be stuck out there too, lost in the noise forever. Every piece of technology with a speaker becomes suspect. Televisions flicker with half-heard conversations. Phones ring without callers. Even the national broadcast itself is corrupted. Faint whispers leaking between official statements, growing louder each time the words repeat. Heaven is full. Heaven is full. The living can hear the dead, but the dead, they can hear us too, and they don't sound happy. By sunrise, governments around the world had settled on a single strategy: deny everything. National leaders stood behind podiums, faces pale and hands trembling, assuring their citizens that the broadcast was a hoax, some kind of cyber attack, a psychological operation designed to destabilize global faith systems. They called it spiritual terrorism, an assault on the world's shared beliefs, and they promised investigations were underway. But the cracks showed immediately. The Vatican refused to support the denial. Instead, high-ranking clergy held their own emergency press conference, eyes heavy with exhaustion and fear, and admitted something real had happened. They wouldn't say heaven was full, but they couldn't say it wasn't either. They called for prayer, but their voices shook too much to sound convincing. Scientific communities fractured in real time. Some physicists dismissed the whole thing, calling it superstitious hysteria, but others, those with access to classified religious research programs, refused to speak at all. One astrophysicist quit her post live on air, saying, "I can't lie to people about what we've seen." The denials grew louder, but the silence from those who knew was louder still. Callers flooded the airwaves, asking the questions governments couldn't answer. If it's a hoax, why are priests resigning? If it's fake, why did the sky over Jerusalem pulse at the exact moment the broadcast began? If heaven isn't full, then where are the dead supposed to go? The official story collapsed faster than it could be written. No one trusted the denials, no one trusted the silence, and somewhere beneath the noise of press conferences and emergency statements, a second story was starting to leak. A story not about hoaxes, but about secrets. Secrets governments had been keeping for decades. The first leak appeared just after noon. An anonymous data dump sent to independent journalists and paranormal researchers alike. Thousands of documents, some centuries old, others stamped with government seals no one recognized, all tied to a single phrase, soul overflow contingency. The documents traced a chilling pattern. Unexplained spiritual anomalies recorded across the globe since at least the 1940s. Prayer backlogs, religious leaders reporting souls that couldn't cross over, describing churches where the air felt too full, too heavy. The files showed governments had quietly partnered with religious institutions using theological monitoring systems to track what they called metaphysical congestion. They treated the afterlife like air traffic control, tracking the invisible movement of souls and quietly adjusting religious doctrine when necessary to avoid panic. A declassified memo from 1978 warned of a future point where entry capacity could max out. It described a scenario eerily close to what was happening now. A global emergency broadcast warning of spiritual gridlock, with governments instructed to immediately deny and contain. But the most chilling file came from a classified Vatican report dated just 4 years ago. It detailed Event 1453A, where a small town in Italy reported 0 successful burials over the course of a full month. Every funeral ended the same way. Priests unable to complete final rites, mourners hearing echoes of the deceased in their homes, as if the dead had simply walked back through the front door. That file ended with a recommendation to prepare for total metaphysical failure within the next decade. Governments knew, churches knew, scientists knew. They all knew heaven was running out of space, and they said nothing. Now the files were everywhere, impossible to suppress. And with every new leak, the same message rang through. This didn't start last night. This started years ago. The streets reacted the way streets always do when trust dies. In cities across the globe, crowds formed, some led by priests begging for mercy, others by conspiracy theorists screaming that this was engineered collapse. Some by people too terrified to believe anything but the loudest voice they could find. Religious riots broke out by the afternoon. In some places, the faithful demanded governments reopen the gates, as if heaven was a fortress with a lock they could force open. In others, mobs blamed religious leaders for selling fake salvation, demanding their churches be burned for lying about eternity. Religious divides sharpened into weapons. Christian against Muslim, Muslim against Hindu, atheist against all of them. Faith became tribal, us versus them, as if belief alone could determine who might find a back door into paradise. One caller described the chaos outside her window. Neighbors dragging priests into the street, forcing them to kneel and confess what they knew. When they didn't have answers, they were beaten. Another caller whispered through tears that her father had joined a mob, chanting, "Open the gates or burn the books." Even within faiths, divisions deepened. Catholics turned against the Vatican for hiding the files. Evangelicals turned against pastors for preaching prosperity, while heaven ran dry. Every system built to comfort people in death was now a target. And beneath the riots and fires, a new belief took hold. If the gates can close, maybe they can be forced open. Rituals began in back alleys and rooftops, prayers sharpened into incantations, offerings turning darker, more desperate. Some believed a blood price could unseal the gates, sacrificing the living to pay off the debts of the dead. The streets were no longer just protests. They were wars for the afterlife. And through the chaos, the broadcast kept playing. Heaven is full. When the riots reached government buildings, when protesters began demanding answers no press secretary could give, governments fell back on their oldest instinct. Control the message. In some countries, entire communication networks were taken offline in the name of public safety, cutting off social media, independent broadcasters, even emergency frequencies. In others, state-run channels seized control, feeding carefully curated narratives, blaming foreign actors, religious extremists, even rogue AI for the original broadcast. The goal was simple. If people couldn't hear the message, maybe they would forget it existed. But they didn't, because one signal wouldn't die. Somewhere, somehow, the original Heaven is Full transmission was still broadcasting, cutting across dead frequencies, bleeding into emergency bands, hijacking satellite relays that should have been locked. The broadcast was a ghost signal, untouchable, untraceable. Every time a government tried to kill it, it returned from a different source, feeding directly into televisions, radios, even smart devices that had been powered off. People held up their phones and heard it through the speakers without making a call. Baby monitors repeated the words inside nurseries. Even encrypted military radios reported hearing it. Soft, steady, the same voice, the same message. Heaven is full. Heaven is full. Heaven is full. Martial law wasn't enough. Curfews didn't matter. Without control of the message, governments had nothing left to govern. And in the silence they tried to create, the rogue broadcast thrived. The message was no longer just news. It was reality, a fact you could no longer turn off. Governments could pull the plug on every screen, every tower, every satellite. It didn't matter. The broadcast had found a new transmitter, the human mind itself. With streets burning, faith in ruins, and the world unable to look away from a message they couldn't stop hearing, world leaders had no choice but to gather. A global emergency summit was called, not to discuss war or famine or climate collapse, but to address the one problem no government had ever prepared for. What do you do with souls when there's nowhere left to send them? The official agenda called it post-mortality resource allocation, a sterile phrase designed to hide the truth. But inside those sealed rooms, the conversations were anything but clean. Religious leaders were invited, but most refused to come. The ones who did arrive were broken, uncertain, and unable to offer a theological solution. Heaven was their jurisdiction, and now heaven was closed. They had nothing left to contribute. The scientists tried next, proposing metaphysical containment zones, spiritual quarantine facilities where souls could be temporarily stored until a long-term solution was found. But no one could explain how to contain something you can't see, can't touch, and don't even fully understand. A delegate from a small nation stood up and asked the question no one wanted to say out loud. What if we can't solve this? What if the dead stay here forever? That question cracked the room open. Suddenly, world leaders were discussing what no one dared consider before, a world permanently haunted, not by metaphor, but by actual souls trapped in the living world. They talked about economic impacts, spiritual inflation, even the possibility of ghost labor. Souls forced into spectral service to offset their metaphysical footprint. The debate circled for hours, no answers emerging, only more fear. Every proposed solution sounded like science fiction. Every religious solution sounded like a lie. And still, the broadcast hummed through the walls, leaking into translation headsets, reminding every delegate why they were there. Heaven is full. There was no policy for that. There was no system. There was only panic in the skin of professionalism, world leaders pretending they were in control when deep down they knew the dead were already here and they weren't leaving. At 6 p.m., a special emergency broadcast begins. Not the rogue signal that started it all, but an officially sanctioned panel, streamed across every surviving network. They've gathered the best they could find under such short notice. 2 theologians, 1 physicist, a renowned paranormal researcher, and a government-appointed metaphysical advisor whose actual qualifications remain suspiciously vague. Their task? To explain the unexplainable. What does it mean when heaven is full? The physicist opens, visibly uncomfortable, admitting that science was never designed to answer this question. But the data suggests something real has happened. Seismic instruments picked up unusual pulses at the exact time of the first broadcast. Satellites detected microscopic fluctuations in the Earth's magnetic field. Anomalies centered on locations long tied to religious significance. Jerusalem, Mecca, the Vatican, and an ancient burial site in Peru. The theologians speak next, but their words are hollow. They admit religious texts never anticipated a scenario where heaven reaches capacity. Scripture describes heaven as infinite, until now. They can only suggest that humanity's sins have overloaded the system. The paranormal researcher interrupts, calm, clinical. According to her, ancient belief systems from multiple cultures contain whispers of a concept called soul congestion, where the dead outnumber the available space to hold them. It's rare, she says, only happens when civilizations collapse under their own spiritual rot. The metaphysical advisor stays silent. It's not a debate, it's a funeral for certainty. As the panel stumbles forward, one thing becomes clear. Science doesn't have the tools to explain it, and theology doesn't have the courage, and the broadcast itself keeps whispering in the background, refusing to be ignored. Heaven is full. The conversation fractures almost immediately. One theologian insists the event is purely spiritual, divine punishment for centuries of corrupted prayer. A metaphysical traffic jam caused by faith turned transactional. In his view, God didn't close the gates. Humanity filled them with empty promises and meaningless rituals. The physicist rejects that. If heaven exists, it must obey some form of cosmic law, even if humanity doesn't understand it yet. He theorizes heaven could be a pocket dimension tethered to Earth's magnetic field. Every soul creates a ripple. And over millennia, those ripples could have filled the available quantum space. The paranormal researcher offers something worse, the idea that heaven might not have always belonged to humanity. Ancient cultures believed souls traveled through borrowed corridors, pathways left open by older civilizations. If those corridors were meant to close long ago, and humanity simply forced them open through blind belief, then this isn't a natural event. It's a system failure caused by trespassers who overstayed their welcome. That's when the metaphysical advisor finally speaks. Not to offer a theory, but to warn that none of this matters anymore. The theological, the scientific, the paranormal, all of it assumes there's still something left to fix. But the advisor claims the truth is simpler. Heaven didn't close because it was full. It closed because something inside broke. Theories pile on top of each other. A collapse of dimensions, a spiritual sinkhole, divine corruption, spreading outward like rot from a wound no one noticed until it was too late. And through it all, the rogue broadcast hums quietly like a heartbeat beneath the noise, its message becoming not just warning, but sentence. Heaven is full. Then the leak hits. A flood of files, centuries old, emerging from inside the Vatican itself, archives long locked away, even from the faithful. The files contain ancient prophecies, handwritten by monks who claim to hear the machinery of heaven groaning under the weight of unworthy souls. The most chilling document is labeled the Deadlock Prophecy, A warning left by a nameless scribe who claimed heaven's gates would seal shut when human faith became too corrupted to recognize the divine. The prophecy doesn't predict divine wrath. It describes administrative collapse, as though heaven itself runs on rules no one understood until they were broken. One prophecy describes a day when prayers no longer ascend, not because God refuses to hear, but because there's nowhere left to put them. Every soul, every prayer, every confession, all of it jamming the system like a clogged drain. And when that day comes, the dead don't leave. They stay. They walk the earth in silence, pressing against the living until the living become the dead, and the dead become the air itself. The files reveal something else. The Vatican knew this was coming. Decades ago, secret conferences with world governments discussed what to do if the prophecy proved true. The files list contingency plans, suppression of afterlife research, intentional discrediting of paranormal phenomena, even a joint doctrine designed to discourage belief in ghosts, all to prevent people from realizing the dead were already gathering. The deadlock wasn't prophecy, it was policy, ignored until it was too late. The panel falls silent. There are no arguments left. The rogue broadcast doesn't stop. It only grows louder. Heaven is full. The debate fractures into silence until a physicist leans forward and says something no one else dares to voice. What if we've been wrong from the start? What if heaven was never infinite? The panel stares at him, too stunned to interrupt. He explains, souls, if they exist, must occupy space. Not physical space, not matter as we understand it, but some kind of metaphysical footprint. If every soul leaves an imprint, a weight on the cosmic scale, then even paradise has limits. It's not infinite love or infinite forgiveness. It's real estate. And that real estate may have run out centuries ago. He describes the terrifying possibility that heaven's gates didn't close all at once. They started shutting slowly. So quietly no one noticed. A little less room with each passing century. A queue forming just outside the gates, growing longer and longer until the dead were stacked against each other. Millions of souls deep, waiting for a space that would never open. Theologians scoff. Scripture calls heaven eternal. It has no end, no borders, no upper limit. But the physicist doesn't blink. He reminds them that infinity exists only in theory. And theory doesn't survive contact with reality. Every system, no matter how divine, can clog. And if souls have nowhere to go, they start backing up. First into limbo, then into the cracks between worlds, and finally into the living world itself. The priest on the panel whispers a prayer under his breath, too soft for the microphone to catch. But the physicist isn't done. He says the backlog isn't just a theory, it's measurable. Strange spiritual interference detected for years. Unexplained voices in recordings. Phantom apparitions. Mass sightings. They weren't ghosts. They were overflow. Spirits forced back into a world that no longer belonged to them. Heaven, the physicist says, isn't a kingdom. It's a warehouse. And it's been full for a very, very long time. A theologian's voice breaks the silence, barely above a whisper. If heaven is full, what about hell? The words hang there, fragile and terrible. No one wants to answer, but the physicist does. If the afterlife is a system, a balance of incoming and outgoing souls, then hell would have limits too. If heaven is full and hell has been receiving its share since the beginning, why would hell still have room? The panel struggles to process the weight of that implication. Heaven isn't just full. Hell may be overflowing. The paranormal researcher adds something worse, that the oldest legends, the darkest prophecies, always warned of a moment called the spillage, when hell itself could no longer contain its dead, when the souls of the damned would seep into the world of the living, not as apparitions, but as raw hunger, mindless and corrupted, incapable of peace or purpose. If that's true, the dead we're hearing now, the whispers inside radios and televisions, the faces pressed against windows, they aren't just lost souls. They might be something worse. The physicist asked the question no one wants to answer. If heaven is sealed and hell is spilling over, where do the newly dead go? There's no answer, no scripture to reference, no ancient prophecy that covers this. There is only the present moment, unraveling in real time, with no divine safety net to catch anyone. The broadcast hums again, a constant pulse under the conversation. Heaven is full, but somewhere, buried in the static, another whisper bleeds through. Not heaven, not hell, just here. The dead aren't leaving anymore. They're staying right where they fell. And they're not alone. The line crackles before her voice comes through, soft, shaking, as though speaking the words out loud might make them real. She doesn't give her name. She just calls herself a granddaughter. She says her grandmother passed 2 years ago. A quiet death, nothing violent, just old age and a tired heart. They held the funeral, said their prayers, lowered her into the earth, and believed she was at peace. But tonight, she's back. She's standing outside the window, not in a dream, not as a memory surfacing in grief. She's physically there, barefoot, still wearing the lavender dress they buried her in, hands pressed to the glass. The caller describes her face, and her voice breaks. Her grandmother's eyes are wide, confused, like she doesn't understand where she is or why the door won't open. The caller whispers that she tried to speak to her, but the old woman's mouth wouldn't move, lips frozen, breathless, like a photograph caught between frames. She knocks on the window, gently at first, then harder, desperate to be let inside. The granddaughter asks, voice trembling, "What happens if I open the door?" No one answers. The hosts stay silent. The panelists from earlier are long gone, and there's only the hum of the rogue broadcast still playing beneath the call. The granddaughter begs for advice. Should she open the door? Should she pray? Should she pretend she never saw? Before the call cuts out, she whispers something that chills the entire broadcast. She isn't alone. There are others standing behind her grandmother. Dozens, hundreds, more than the eye can count, all of them waiting, all of them staring at the door. The next caller doesn't tremble. His voice is steady, resigned. A man with nothing left to lose. He identifies himself only as Father Michael, and he confesses before anyone can ask a question. He knew. Not just tonight, not just this week. He knew for years. Father Michael was present at a secret meeting held deep within the Vatican's inner chambers. A gathering of clergy who had seen the first signs of overflow. They received the reports, prayers bouncing back unanswered, souls refusing to move beyond the threshold, funeral rites becoming spiritually ineffective. They knew heaven was slowly closing, but they said nothing. Out of fear, out of duty, out of the belief that maybe if they prayed hard enough, they could unclog the gates before anyone noticed. But it didn't work. Father Michael says he personally officiated at least 70 funerals where he knew the soul never left the room. They stayed, hovering in silence, unable to ascend, unable to move on. He saw the fear in grieving families' eyes, the way they felt it, even if they couldn't explain it. Some described hearing the voice of the deceased long after the body was in the ground. Some swore the dead followed them home. Father Michael buried those fears beneath ritual and routine, convincing himself it was temporary, that heaven would eventually reopen if they just held the faith. But tonight, the faith collapsed. He doesn't ask for forgiveness, only that someone tell the truth. His final words before the line cuts are barely a whisper. They're still waiting. Every soul I failed to help, they're here. in the room with me. The silence after his call feels heavier than the words themselves. The last caller's voice is weak but clear. You can hear it in his breathing. Each word costs him something. His name is Thomas. He's dying. Terminal cancer, diagnosed last year. Hospice told him he might have a few months left. He made peace with that. He truly believed, that heaven would be waiting when the time came. But then the broadcast began. Thomas has been lying in bed, listening to the words repeat, "Heaven is full." He says it doesn't feel real, not until now. He spent his life preparing for the moment he would let go, believing he would step into light, into warmth, into peace. But now he realizes there's nowhere to step. So he asks the only question left, is there another way in? Not just for him, for everyone like him, people at the edge of life, people who don't have time to wait for governments and religions to debate theology. He asked the broadcasters to help find a new heaven, somewhere else to go, some other faith, some forgotten passage, some ancient ritual that might open a door no one else thought to knock on. He says he'll take anything, not paradise, not perfection, just somewhere that isn't here. The hosts have no answers, no one does. Thomas coughs hard, too hard, but forces out one last sentence before the line goes dead. Please, don't let me die with nowhere to go. And then silence. The rogue broadcast hums beneath it all, whispering the only certainty left. Heaven is full. The calls from the living have slowed, but something else has taken their place. It starts faintly, a low hum beneath the broadcast, a tremor in the frequency itself. At first, the hosts think it's a technical glitch, one more artifact from a system overloaded by fear and speculation. But then the hum changes. It bends, stretches into something sharper, clearer. It becomes voices, not callers, not listeners. These voices don't ask questions. They don't tell stories. They simply repeat over and over, as though trying to speak through a door too thick to hear through. Some are clear, others distorted, but the words themselves are unmistakable. I'm still here. I never left. Tell them I'm waiting. It doesn't stop. Every frequency, every channel, every emergency broadcast line picks up the same signal. The voices of the dead bleeding through the airwaves. Some are frantic, desperate to be heard. Others are flat, drained of hope, resigned to whatever limbo they now inhabit. But all of them share one terrifying truth. They're still here. The static grows louder, filling gaps between the host's words, making it harder to tell who's alive and who isn't anymore. When a caller tries to speak, their voice blends with the static until they sound half dead themselves. It's no longer just a rogue transmission. The broadcast itself has become a conduit, not for news, not for answers, but for the dead. They've found a way in. They're not trying to tell stories. They're trying to come home. The final call cuts through the static without warning. No introduction, no phone number displayed, just a voice, young, trembling, barely above a whisper. They're waiting at the door. It's the granddaughter again, her voice hollow with terror. She says the dead outside her window have grown restless. They're no longer just standing, they're knocking, soft at first, then louder, until it sounds like bones hammering on wood. She tried to open the door once, just a crack. Just enough to see if they could come inside, or if they would disappear like a bad dream when faced with the living world. But the door wouldn't move. Not locked, not jammed, just refusing to open as though something on the other side is holding it shut. Now, more voices join hers, some from other calls, some from the static itself. They all whisper the same phrase. They're waiting at the door, but the door won't open. The static surges, washing over the broadcast like a wave, then silence, but not the silence of peace, the silence of something holding its breath. The leaks didn't stop at the Vatican files. Tonight, sealed archives, some hidden for centuries, are wide open. Religious vaults, classified government files, and restricted metaphysical research papers have all spilled into the public, like blood from a cracked vein. What they reveal is almost too vast to understand. A timeline of warnings stretching back longer than recorded history itself. Prophets, monks, mystics, across every faith, every culture, scribbled the same prophecy in different tongues across different centuries, but always with the same conclusion. There would come a day when heaven locks its gates, not because of sin, not because of divine punishment, but because the system itself would collapse under the weight of too many unworthy souls. These weren't vague apocalyptic poems. They were technical warnings, descriptions of spiritual congestion, soul overflow, metaphysical gridlock. Religious leaders knew for centuries that heaven was not an infinite sky, but a reservoir. And like any reservoir, it could flood. The files show councils held in secret, meetings between theologians and heads of state discussing contingency plans no citizen was ever supposed to hear. Plans to delay the inevitable by adjusting funeral rites, rewriting doctrines, discouraging certain prayers, anything to slow the flow into heaven's crowded halls. But none of it worked. Tonight isn't prophecy fulfilled. Tonight is the result of a cover-up that ran out of time. While government suppressed the truth, someone else remembered. Buried in the margins of conspiracy forums and fringe broadcasts, the cults always knew. Apocalyptic sects dismissed as lunatics, groups who believed the afterlife was just another piece of infrastructure, are now resurfacing, not to say I told you so, but to claim their place in history. They call themselves the Keepers of the Queue, a name ripped straight from centuries-old manuscripts, describing heaven as a cosmic waiting room where souls stand in line, waiting for judgment like passengers waiting for a train that may never come. These cults preach that one day the doors would lock, not to punish the wicked, but because faith itself would overpopulate paradise. They believe prayers acted like requests for entry, and humanity's obsession with salvation would eventually choke the gates shut. They weren't trying to stop it. They were preparing for it. They trained themselves to survive the world after heaven closes, developing rituals not to ascend, but to anchor themselves here, blending with the physical world to escape the congestion in the afterlife. To them, tonight is the beginning, not the end. They call it the day of return, when the living and the dead become one species, both trapped in the same reality, neither able to move on. They aren't afraid. They're celebrating. The next file leak is worse than prophecy. It's proof. Hidden among government documents is a folder labeled Project Threshold, a black budget program that didn't study afterlife overflow. It caused it. According to these files, certain world powers, working in collaboration with rogue religious orders, experimented with forced spiritual acceleration. They believed that if they could pre-clear souls before death, they could free up space in heaven, keeping the system functional for longer. They called it soul optimization. The process involves psychic mass rituals, subliminal prayers embedded in broadcasts, and manipulating religious ceremonies to pre-register souls for entry, long before they died. It backfired spectacularly. Instead of clearing space, the rituals jammed the gates open, flooding heaven with souls who hadn't actually finished living. It created a metaphysical logjam, souls arriving incomplete, unable to process, unable to move forward, clogging the entire system. Project Threshold was shut down in 2007. But by then, the damage was done. Heaven didn't close because humanity sinned too much. It closed because humanity tried to hack the system and broke it beyond repair. Theories spiral out of control. Governments blame rogue cults. Cults blame governments. Religious leaders blame humanity itself. Conspiracy theorists blame entities older than any faith, guardians of the afterlife, who sealed the gates to protect what was left inside. But one theory rises above the rest, a theory so chilling, it brings the entire broadcast to silence. What if it wasn't God? What if the gatekeepers themselves, the ones tasked with guiding souls into heaven, were the ones who locked the door, not out of spite, not out of judgment, but out of sheer cosmic self-preservation. The files mentioned the threshold wardens, an ancient order believed to exist between heaven and earth, custodians who manage the flow of souls like air traffic controllers guiding planes. If the backlog became too great, if the flood of souls became a threat to existence itself, the wardens had a failsafe. Seal the gates, disconnect heaven from earth, leave the living and the dead to fight over whatever space was left. No mercy, no negotiation, just survival. If the gates were locked from the inside, it means heaven hasn't abandoned humanity. Heaven is hiding from it. And now, the only ones left to face the consequences are us. This was never supposed to happen. That's what the host says, voice thinner than it was when this all started. You can hear the exhaustion settling into every word. Not just fatigue, but the weight of trying to speak while the world dies in silence. They were supposed to cover a story, that's all. A strange broadcast, maybe a hoax. A late-night mystery for insomniacs and conspiracy junkies. It was going to be a segment, not the end of everything. But now the broadcast is the funeral, not just for the souls who can't cross, but for certainty itself. Religion was supposed to comfort the dying. Science was supposed to explain the unknown. Government was supposed to protect the helpless. All of it. Every system built to keep humanity upright collapsed in a single day. There are no prayers left that can fix this. No technology that can map it. No treaties that can negotiate with the dead. The host tries to list what's been lost, faith, reason, order, but the list is too long and the words feel too small. The truth is simpler. The world woke up believing heaven was forever, a promise waiting at the end of every life. And now, with one sentence whispered across every frequency, that promise is gone. Heaven is full. The broadcast was supposed to end after that, sign off, static, but they can't, because there's no one left to end it. The broadcast has become a pulse, a heartbeat for a species with nowhere left to go. And so the host speaks directly to the audience, to you, not as a journalist, not as an expert, but as someone who's just as afraid as you are. The calls are different now. They're no longer asking why this is happening. They're asking what comes next. And the answer comes not from experts or governments, but from the streets themselves. Reports are flooding in from every corner of the globe. The dead aren't gone. They aren't waiting in the sky or sinking into the earth. They're here, walking through cities, suburbs, back roads, and neighborhoods. Some glide silently, their shapes thin and pale, like shadows stretched too far. Others seem more solid, familiar faces standing exactly where they died, caught between yesterday and forever. They don't speak, they don't scream, they just exist. A child calls the station, describing her grandmother standing in the driveway, eyes wide, mouth locked open in a silent plea. She doesn't recognize the living, doesn't acknowledge the world around her. She just stands there, waiting for a door that will never open. In some cities, traffic has stopped entirely, not from panic, but because the roads are full of ghosts. Some drivers refuse to move, terrified of running over a soul already lost. Others accelerate straight through, shouting that it doesn't matter anymore, that if there's nowhere left to go, nothing can still die. It's not just isolated sightings. This is global overflow, the dead stacking up in the same world they once left, waiting for a process that no longer works. The host repeats the phrase no one wants to hear, but everyone already knows. The dead are no longer leaving. They're staying. And the living are running out of space. And now the fighting begins. Faith, fractured beyond repair, has turned to blood. Religious factions have formed overnight, each convinced they alone hold the key to reopening heaven. Some demand immediate repentance, mass baptisms in public fountains, prayers shouted from rooftops until voices break. Others believe sacrifice is the only answer. If enough blood is spilled, the gates will reopen. They aren't looking for volunteers. In some cities, priests and imams and monks are dragged into the streets, ordered to perform rituals none of them understand. When the prayers fail, the crowd demands a different kind of offering. The air is thick with smoke and hymns and screams. Other factions believe the only way to force heaven's gates back open is through divine ransom, holding souls hostage, threatening to destroy them if God won't intervene. They gather in groups surrounding ghostly figures, wandering the streets, chanting ancient words meant to bind the dead to the living world. They believe if they can threaten the souls themselves, heaven will have no choice but to negotiate. The host's voice cracks reading these reports. This isn't prophecy, this is panic, blind faith sharpening itself into a knife. Religions that spent centuries claiming heaven was open to all are now guarding the afterlife like it's their private property. They are fighting not for salvation, but for control over what's left. The shattered doorway, the broken ladder, the exit sign hanging above a hallway that leads nowhere. The host admits they don't know which is worse, the silence from heaven or the noise left behind. But the result is the same. The living are fighting over a door that no longer opens, and the dead are watching from the other side. It arrives like a death rattle, broadcasted across every surviving frequency, every emergency channel, every feed still holding on by threads of power. The final message from the United Nations. No flags, no anthem, no promises, just a voice, flat, distant, stripped of ceremony. It belongs to a woman. Her accent indistinct, her tone neither comforting nor authoritative. It's the voice of someone speaking, because there's no one else left to speak. She doesn't deliver a plan, because there isn't one. She doesn't offer hope, because hope belongs to systems that still work. Instead, she tells the truth, the last truth anyone will ever receive from something resembling authority. There is nowhere to go, no higher ground, no distant refuge, no safe nation untouched by the collapse. Death itself has nowhere left to send you. The woman's breath catches once, just once, as though she can't believe what she's reading aloud. Then she continues, voice thinner now. Humanity must prepare to die into nothingness. It's not metaphor, it's not poetry, it's policy, the final entry into the world's emergency response doctrine. There is no heaven, no hell, no rebirth, no cycle, no ascension. There is only here. And once your body fails, your soul will remain, stuck, unclaimed, unable to move forward, backward, or anywhere at all. The transmission repeats twice. Then the woman says something unscripted, so quietly, most listeners miss it the first time. We thought eternity meant forever. We never thought eternity could mean stuck. The line goes dead. No follow-up. No questions taken. No clarifications. The final act of global governance was a funeral announcement for the soul itself. The host's voice trembles, not from emotion, from exhaustion, from the weight of speaking when every word feels like it could be the last thing anyone hears. They repeat the message for anyone who missed it, for anyone still clinging to the hope that maybe they misunderstood. If you die tonight, you stay here forever. It's not a warning anymore. It's a fact, a mechanical reality. Death is no longer a doorway. It's a trap. Every heart attack, every accident, every sudden loss, they don't lead to light or darkness. They lead to this, the same world, the same air, the same ground beneath your feet. Only now your body is gone, and you are nothing but presence, stuck in a place that no longer belongs to you. The broadcast hums low and constant. The static itself feels like it's breathing, full of all the souls already caught in the web. The host says they can't stop thinking about what it must feel like to watch your own body grow cold, to see your loved ones mourn, and then to realize you never left the room. You are here. You will always be here, Even after the living forget you, even after the cities crumble, and the languages change, and the stars burn out, you will still be standing exactly where you died, a ghost not haunting anyone but yourself. The host asks a final question. Not to experts, not to governments, not to anyone who can answer. They ask you, what will you do with your forever? They don't expect an answer. The only answer is silence. And as the broadcast fades, the words repeat one last time. Clear, simple, absolute. If you die tonight, you stay here forever. Then, dead air. The host's voice is breaking. They've run out of updates, out of theories, out of things to say. All that's left is to sign off, to let the static consume whatever comes next. But before they can, the line crackles. An incoming call, cutting through the dead air like a blade. No number, no name, just a voice. It's ancient. Not in the way old men sound, but older, like something that's been speaking since before language had form. The voice calls itself the keeper of the gate. The host tries to ask what that means, but the keeper talks through them, ignoring the question entirely. It says it has been waiting to speak for a very long time, but only now, with heaven sealed and hell ruptured, can the truth be told. The keeper doesn't sound angry. It doesn't sound kind. It sounds indifferent, like a machine announcing the weather, like something that doesn't care whether anyone listens, only that the words are spoken. The host tries to cut the call. Some instinct buried deep, the need to turn away from something too big to hold in a human mind. But the line won't disconnect. The keeper says humanity earned this moment. And now it's time to listen. The keeper says heaven didn't collapse under the weight of sin or evil or punishment. It collapsed under the weight of prayers. Too many prayers, too many rituals, too many desperate, hollow pleas offered not in faith, but in bargain. Prayers traded for wealth, for revenge, for things no heaven was ever meant to grant. Each false prayer, each broken promise became spiritual pollution, clogging the machinery of the afterlife until nothing could pass cleanly through. Souls entered twisted, bent by the weight of their own unworthiness, stacking up like bodies in a trench. Faith, the keeper says, was never meant to be a currency, something spent and hoarded, but humanity made it one, turning salvation into a transaction, and in doing so, poisoned the very air of the divine. For centuries, the keepers worked silently, clearing paths, scraping away the rot, unclogging the arteries of eternity. But the flow never stopped, and the prayers kept coming. Empty words, shouted louder, faster, by billions of mouths, all demanding to be heard first, until one day the gates broke, and with them the boundary between the living and the dead dissolved. The keeper says heaven didn't close to punish humanity. Heaven closed because it couldn't breathe anymore. The keeper's voice grows quieter now, not softer, but heavier, like the weight of its own words are pulling it down. It says humanity always feared hell, but hell was never the threat. The true horror was always the possibility that Earth itself would become the afterlife, a world where no soul could leave, no spirit could ascend or descend, where death became just another kind of stagnant life. That's exactly what happened. This world, our world, is now the waiting room for all eternity. There is no heaven above, no hell below, only this one overcrowded space where the living and the dead stand shoulder to shoulder, caught in a traffic jam without an exit. We built our own afterlife. We filled it with our fears, our bargains, our greed, our desperate craving for divine attention. The gates didn't close to keep us out. They closed because we made heaven impossible to enter. The keeper says there is no appeal, no second chance, no hidden door. This is it. Earth is now eternity, and we are all already dead. The keeper takes one final breath, though it has no lungs. It says the broadcast will end after these words because no more truth exists to tell. There will be no second voice, no hidden savior, no sudden miracle that fixes what's already gone. There is only this. This is the last voice you will ever hear. Not because technology will fail, not because governments will fall, but because after tonight, there will be nothing left to say. Every prayer has already been spoken. Every answer has already been refused. Every soul has already been counted. What's left now is silence. The silence of a species standing at the edge of its own reflection, forced to look at what it has become. The keeper says, "Make peace with the silence." The line goes dead. The broadcast ends. The silence begins. This is where I'm supposed to sign off. But after tonight, I'm not sure sign-offs mean anything anymore. You've been here with me through every call, every whisper, every warning we were never meant to hear. And now, as the broadcast fades, I have to ask you something. Not as a host, not as a voice in the dark, but as someone standing on the same ground, breathing the same air, waiting for the same silence. If we've truly made Earth our afterlife, if there's nowhere left to go when we die, what happens to the memories we leave behind? Do they drift beside us, weightless, caught between worlds like we are? Or do they sink faster than we can catch them, until all we have left is the fear of forgetting who we ever were? I need you to tell me, in the comments right now, what do you believe happens to the memories of the dead when there's nowhere left for them to rest? And if this story made you feel even a fraction of the fear we've shared tonight, do me a favor, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, because I promise you, this isn't the last story that's been buried. Share this broadcast with someone you love, because memories deserve to be shared, not lost in the silence. This is VoiceCast, signing off from nowhere, for now.